You may find it disturbing to watch. Emily are spending Easter at his Florida resort, but when he returns to Washington later this afternoon, a familiar face and a close confidant, well, she'll be missing. The president said goodbye to his former communications director, Hope Hicks, on Thursday. Sources tell CNN that he may not replace her. According to the Washington Post, President Trump is growing more independent and defiant, and he wants to call his own shots. CNN's Abby Phillip joins us live from Florida, where the president is this morning. Abby?
Good morning, Diane. Yeah, the president here in Florida for the Easter weekend, where he spent it mostly playing golf and sending a few tweets. But once he returns to Washington this afternoon, he's going to be in a mood, according to the Washington Post, to do exactly what he wants to do. For the last several weeks, there have been a significant number of senior departures here in this White House, but perhaps the most meaningful is the departure of Hope Hicks, who is someone who is a close confidant of the president's, who's been around him for a very long time, and who, according to White House aides, is sort of a guardrail for him, guiding him along in decision-making processes. And what is left now is a president who doesn't want to slow things down. He doesn't want to seek counsel of aides who have differing opinions. He wants to do exactly what he wants to do. According to the Washington Post, in a new report, they have reported that the president is increasingly surrounding himself with people who view the world just like he does. Just in the past week, he dined with his former campaign aides, Corey Lewandowski and David Bossie. Lewandowski, who at one point was almost banned from the White House by the Chief of Staff, John Kelly. There have also been reports that John Kelly is increasingly being sidelined by the president retreating to the residence, meeting with his close confidants, talking to friends on the phone, and making decisions in that way. We've seen this publicly in a number of important decisions over the last several weeks on tariffs. He announced in the last week that he wanted to pull out of Syria, catching his Defense Department off guard. So this is a president who is eager to move forward exactly the way that he wants to. Later this morning, Diane, we might see the president going to Easter services here in Mar-a-Lago, which he and the First Lady have done in the past. Diane and Victor.
All right, Abby Phillip for us there near the president's resort. Abby, thank you so much.
Right. Also this morning, the U.S. and South Korea kicking off massive military drills off the Korean peninsula. These so-called war games typically involve tens of thousands of troops, tanks, bombers, and even submarines. It's quite the photo op and ordeal. But this year, the exercises are taking on a different tone, as both the U.S. and South Korea hope to avoid upsetting the North Korean dictator as they negotiate over nuclear weapons. CNN military and diplomatic analyst Rear Admiral John Kirby joins me now. And Admiral Kirby, look, these drills are going to be shorter this year. They're 4 weeks instead of 8 weeks long like they were in previous years. And we know publicly that the Olympics were cited as some of the reasoning for that. That's why they started later. But look, sources are telling CNN that diplomatic developments on the peninsula is what led to these concessions. Should we see this as a positive sign, or is this something that could be detrimental to the military efforts in the Pacific?
Well, I think it's both a positive sign, but I don't think it at all is detrimental to our military readiness. So it's much more the former, not the latter. Look, even at 1 month, if that's what this ends up being, you still have about 23,000 U.S. troops, 300,000 or so South Koreans involved in this, South Korean military forces. That's pretty sizable. And as some of that video you showed, this is a full spectrum exercise. It won't have an aircraft carrier, but there will be Navy ships. They'll be testing air and ground forces as well. It's going to be pretty robust. But I do think clearly that part of the reason it's a bit scaled down and shortened is to take advantage of this new diplomatic breakthrough that we seem to have on the peninsula, and this makes sense. So from the U.S. perspective, we get to focus on military readiness. We get to try to make sure that we continue to send a strong message about our treaty commitments to the South and the seriousness with which we take the security on the peninsula. At the same time, we're taking measures that are in keeping with the warmer rhetoric, the reduced tensions that are on the peninsula. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, Admiral Kirby, so many of the journalists there have said that they weren't invited, as they have been many years, to sort of see this grand finale where they sort of show off at the end of it and allow them to get video, allow them to report on this. It appears they're trying to kind of keep it off the front pages of the newspapers, not just here, but also over there.
Yeah, it seems to me like, again, I think there's wisdom here that you don't want to overly provoke Kim Jong-un. What's really going to be interesting as we watch this exercise now start to move forward is how the North reacts. In the past, when they have announced it, and they usually announce it in February, March, the North reacts with a bellicose statement, and then shortly after, usually there's some rocket launches. Last year, 1 week after the exercise began, the North launched 4 medium-range ballistic missiles in response. We'll have to see how he reacts. I suspect that they are calculating that he won't overreact, and that's probably one reason why they're maybe not being as forward-leaning on the media posture as they have in the past. Just no reason to provoke it. Remember, too, that you have a potential summit here coming up between Kim and President Moon later in April, and that's important to make sure that that meeting gets off on a good foot as well.
Thank you so much, Rear Admiral John Kirby. Potentially something with President Trump later as well.
14 minutes after the hour now, President Trump will be heading back to Washington today with an increasingly smaller team around him. But according to new reporting from CNN and the Washington Post, that may be just what he wants. Joining me now, CNN political analyst Julian Zelizer and commentary writer and editor for the Washington Examiner, Siraj Hashmi. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning. Happy Easter.
Happy Easter to you. First, let's start with you, Siraj. And, the president's supporters, for many of them, this is what they wanted him to do, to go in, shake it up. If you don't need the people around you, get rid of them. Sarah Sanders, White House press secretary, says the president is in an action mood and does not want to slow roll things from trade to border to staff changing. What's wrong with that?
Well, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, there's probably a lot of things that Donald Trump used to do in the private setting when he operated his own business and, multi-million and possibly billion-dollar enterprise. What's interesting, though, is that he's growing more and more insular from what many Americans are viewing. It almost reminds you of the movie Scarface, save for the murder and the, mountains of cocaine, in which Tony Montana became more insular and kind of alienated the people around him. So I have no idea if that's actually true, in which he's actually alienating people in the White House. But it certainly seems like he's kind of becoming more and more independent.
Tony Montana, really? Really? That's what we're doing this morning? That's what we're doing? Let me come to you, Julian. So on the point of policy and trying to get things done, we may see a president who is trying to move at a pace, obviously what he's used to in business. This may not have much to do with the president's personality, but his resume, that he's not used to moving at the glacial pace of Congress.
Right. Well, what he calls the glacial pace, others might call the democratic process. In politics, making progress involves negotiation, it involves compromise, and finally, it involves hearing opinions that are different from your own, because that is the way our political system works. So the problem is, I think there's going to be a conflict between the way that he did business or the way that he sees the world and the way that our democratic processes work. And I'm not sure he's going to be able to change that.
So, Siraj, let's take, for instance, the president a few weeks back announcing these tariffs on all steel and aluminum imports coming to the country. Initially, that was across the board. And then as the policy took a step further, there were exemptions for the EU, for Canada, for Mexico, for Brazil, for Argentina, for South Korea. I mean, it went on and on and on until most of them now are at a quota system. I mean, there is still bureaucracy. So to what degree will these impulses that the reporting from the Washington Post and CNN says that the president will now rely on will actually make it to policy?
Well, what's the interesting part about this, and you talked about the South Korea war games in the previous segment. A lot of people would look at that as kind of a re-escalation of tensions within the Korean Peninsula, and people might attribute that to John Bolton, who's going to become the National Security Advisor. However, what's interesting is that President Trump has just done whatever he wants to do. Right now, by taking away a lot of these people within the White House, you're kind of just removing the middleman of people who would just tell him no, when really he's just going to do what he wants to do anyways. And of course, the Tony Montana example may not be the best example, but it's interesting to find that the president might be growing more insular in his thinking. And I would say that General Jim Mattis may be the one person outside of the White House who has the most influence on him in terms of what he did with the $1.3 trillion spending omnibus bill and building up the military, really sacrificing funding for the wall.
Yeah, one of those, many of those stabilizers that people thought were going to come in to help this president are now out. Rex Tillerson, H.R. McMaster coming in, the second national security advisor, and of course, Mattis is still there at defense. Let's switch to another promise the president made during the campaign, Julian, and that is building the wall along the border. The president tweeted out pictures last week of what he says was construction on the new border wall. Turns out this was just replacement of old fencing. The Customs and Border Protection Deputy Commissioner held a news conference this week. They sent out this press release saying construction is underway of the new border wall. Well, here's actually what's happening from that acting Deputy Commissioner himself.
In Calexico, we're on schedule and on budget to build a new 30-foot border wall as approved by the administration. This replaces 2 miles of pedestrian barrier. In the Rio Grande Valley, we're building 35 new gates along a stretch of 55 miles of existing border wall. We plan to replace at least 47 miles of dilapidated border fencing with new border wall system. Also in RGV, we plan to build about 25 miles of new levee wall in Hidalgo County, as well as 8 miles of new border wall system in Starr County, Texas.
So much of that is replacement of existing fencing. Did the definition of new and wall change with this administration?
Absolutely. This is Trump rebranding 101, meaning he can't get the wall that he wants so far. So instead, take other things, such as fixing up existing walls, and brand them as the Trump wall. This is a very important campaign promise to him. He can't get what he wants. There's the democratic processes at work. So he's going to try to call something that looks like a wall, the wall. And he might be successful with his supporters, but I think it's far short of what he intended to do.
Siraj, listen to mayors on either side of this fencing that's being replaced.
We all as a community want to make sure that the people out there in this country know that Calexico, California is not the beginning of a wall project for the Trump administration. It is completely different.
We knew that it was a lie.
Do the supporters potentially, will they buy that this is the wall that they chanted for?
Well, not if it's coming from CNN. I mean, if it was coming from Fox News, then probably. What's interesting, though, is that there are some supporters, true, like America First policy supporters who understand that this is actually, who actually believe CNN's reporting on this, that actually is not new wall and that it's replacement fencing. And the 100 miles of border wall that they're actually using the $1.6 billion on is really not 100 miles of continuous wall. It's, you know, in bits and pieces along the border. This is not something that they really signed up for. They really wanted the entire sub 2,000, you know, almost 2,000 miles of the southern border to be reinforced with border security and the border wall, and it's not meeting up to their standards.
And Mexico is going to pay for that. Siraj Hashmi, Julian Zelizer, thanks so much.
Holding up inside his room and a pricey shopping spree that included a Corvette. A student at the University of Central Florida is being deported to China after the school's police chief said there was red flag after red flag that something bad would happen.
We just saved a bunch of lives. There's no doubt about it.
Police started investigating 26-year-old Wen Liang's son earlier this year after he made unusual statements to a school official. They flagged it to the ATF and found out that Son owned an assault-style rifle and ammunition. When a detective interviewed him, Son referred to his weapon as a sniper rifle, but said he never thought about hurting himself or others. Days after that interview, Son bought a second assault-style rifle, this one with a bipod and expensive scope. Police were monitoring Son, but officials say he owned both guns legally.
We know if one individual falls through the cracks, very bad things can happen.
But then his visa was revoked due to an issue unrelated to his gun purchases. He stopped going to class.
So I think there was a disaster about to happen, and we stopped it.
Son is now being held by immigration officials and is expected to be deported soon, and he will not be allowed to return to the U.S. for 10 years.
Well, campus police say that other students who own guns should not be concerned. They say this case was about the behavior of one student whose actions showed that he was in crisis.
Some harsh words from NRA board member and rocker N.E.W.S. It happened during an interview on a conservative radio program that he called on survivors of the Parkland shooting. He called them liars and mushy-brained children. Now, when asked how the students are railing against the NRA, he says, quote, "Not only is it ignorant and dangerously stupid, but it's soulless." Meanwhile, outspoken Parkland survivor David Hogg is standing up against the criticism that he received from Fox News host Laura Ingraham. This comes after she mocked him in a series of tweets a little bit earlier this week, and then she later apologized.
I think my biggest takeaway from this is when somebody, no matter who somebody is, no matter how big or powerful they may seem, a bully is a bully, and it's important that you stand up to them.
More than a dozen companies pulled their advertising from Laura Ingraham's show after her attacks. Now, she announced that she would be on vacation next week amid all the controversy, but said it was a pre-planned take of leave for this Easter week. Now, joining us to discuss, CNN senior media correspondent and host of Reliable Sources, Brian Stelter. Good morning, Brian. Let's get to N.E.W.S. first.
Morning.
He said this on a conservative radio program. I want people to see it again. The dumbing down of America is manifested in the culture deprivation of our academia that have taught these kids the lies. I really feel sorry for them because it's not only ignorant and dangerously stupid, but it's soulless. He's name-calling. He's blaming their education. Some of the students are demanding an apology. It appears that he's a little bit different than Laura Ingraham here because he's attacking their education, and that's why they are in this way that he disapproves of. Does this help this situation at all?
Yeah, no, let's state the obvious, first of all. If you are an adult and you are attacking high school students, you're losing. And I think that's some of what we are seeing in these responses, some of these mostly right-wing responses to the Parkland students. Obviously, in the weeks since the massacre there's been a lot of debate about guns, and there's a lot of disagreement with these students. Most of these students have taken a position in favor of more gun control. They are supporting specific steps they'd like to see taken, specific laws they'd like to see passed or changed, and we should be debating those proposals. But what we've seen as well are these really gross attacks against the students. David Hogg in particular, Emma Gonzalez in particular, some of the other students have been targeted as well. There have been conspiracy theories against them, and there's been name calling. And then, the kind of rhetoric we're seeing from N.E.W.S, it just seems to me really clear that if someone like N.E.W.S, he's losing the argument, so thus he's going in this direction. And we've seen a bunch of that in the past 6 weeks or so. Look, what's interesting about teenagers, we all remember being teenagers. You're learning a lot. You're learning. You're figuring out how to go about in this world. I don't think the students are going to get every single message right every single time, but they're trying to figure it out. And to go after their education, or as Laura Ingraham did, to mock the not getting into college, that's obviously way too low a blow.
So, speaking of Laura Ingraham and David Hogg, she did apologize. The advertisers pulled out of her show. She's going to be off the airwaves. Is it about the actual name calling, though, Brian? Because, look, I've been with these kids. They're putting themselves out there. We're treating them as experts in this situation. Is it about the individual meanness of the name calling, or is it about challenging them? Because it does seem that maybe there's a bit of a double standard here. Some of the kids who are a bit more conservative, Kyle Kashuv, the Pollock family, they seem to indicate that they don't feel like they're getting the same sort of defense from members of the media and really just the Twitter sphere as well when people attack them for their viewpoints.
I think that we need, members of the media and people that want to reasonably engage in this gun debate should be consistent. Yeah, absolutely, should be consistent. But when Laura Ingraham goes and mocks David Hogg in this case, I think there was an almost universal sense that was beyond the pale. Thus, you see these advertisers withdrawing. Look, I think ad boycotts are dangerous, and that's maybe a separate discussion. But when you look at these situations, you mentioned Kyle, one of the other students. There was talk on Twitter about whether Kurt Eichenwald of MSNBC had been criticizing, attacking Kyle, and as a result, MSNBC should suffer an ad boycott. Well, actually, an advertiser withdrew from MSNBC without knowing that Eichenwald was no longer a contributor. He wasn't on the payroll. It gets very messy very quickly when you talk about ad boycotts, and the Laura Ingraham one is no exception. Now she's on vacation for a week. Fox says it was pre-planned. I assume she'll be back at the end of her vacation, but this vacation's a period for everything to cool down. But bottom line, these students have incredible political power, and when you see